Okay, good morning, everybody. So in the last notebook, we were talking about how to write a bash script. So we'll just continue in that notebook. Then we'll talk about variables. And then if we have time, we'll start to talk about strings. So bash has the concept of a comment. So the comment works just like it does in Python. The comment in bash is just the hashtag. Right? So that's the line-ending comment in bash. There is no multi-line comment in bash, like there is in Java. Right? So commenting works basically the same as it does in Python. This is a little program that consists of nothing but comments. Right? And so if you run that program, you would think that it does nothing. But in fact, it actually does do something. So if you run it, nothing gets printed out, which is what you expect. There's no print or echo statement here. Right? But it turns out that every command that you run in bash, or every command that you run in Linux or Unix, produces what's called an exit status. Right? So when you run this program, some integer value gets passed back to the operating system. Right? That integer value is called the exit status. The exit status is always non-negative, so it's not supposed to be negative. Now, to get the exit status in bash, you have to use what looks to be a funny syntax. And so the exit status in bash is stored in something that's called a special parameter. So bash calls, if you ever see the word parameter in bash, that's similar to a variable in bash. So it ends up setting the special parameter that's called, and it has a weird name. It's called the question mark. Right now, this is confusing because the question mark also shows up in file name expansions. Right? If you use the question mark in a file name expansion, that means match any single character. But in this context, it means it stores the value of the exit status. Right? So notice there's this blue box here that elaborates on what a parameter is in bash. Right? So a parameter is anything that stores a value, which means it sort of looks like a variable. Right? Now in bash makes the distinction between variables that start with a letter and variables that don't start with a letter. So if it doesn't start with a letter, it's called a parameter. Question mark is one of those parameters. There's a bunch of other ones that you're going to see today too. Right? It's a special parameter, meaning that usually the programmer can't set the value of that parameter. So they can only look at the value. All right, if you want to get the exit status of a command, then the value is stored in question mark. But to get the value, or to actually access the value, you need to use the $ in front of the question mark. Right? I'm going to explain why you need to use the $ when we talk about variables. So $question mark, that's the value of the exit status of the most recently completed command. Right? So this little script here, or sorry, this little cell code here, right, runs that script that I just showed you. So it runs comment.sh, right, which looks like it does nothing. Right? But when you print the exit status of the program, right, you do in fact get a value. So you get 0. Right? So a program that completes cleanly without encountering any errors, normally but not always, returns 0 as the exit status. If you get a non-zero value, that normally indicates that something unusual has happened. Right? Exactly what has happened depends on the command that you just ran. Right? You have to look at the documentation to determine what the exit status is trying to tell you. Right? But at most, usually what you assume though is that 0 means command completed successfully. Non-zero means something unusual happened. Right? Later on, we'll see how you can actually set the exit status of one of your scripts. Commands can appear, so they work just like Python comments, right? So you can put them after a line of code, like this one right here. Sorry, it's wrapping because the zoom is too large. Where'd it go? Here. Right, so inside a script, oh, it's still wrapping, hang on. There you go. Right, so comments end a line, right, which means you can put them after a line of code. And then nothing else happens after the start of the hashtag. If you quote or escape the hashtag symbol, then that's not a comment. Right? So if you want to use the hashtag symbol in a string, for example, you can quote the string. Right? Single quotes or double quotes works fine here. Backslash also works. Right? So if we run this little script here, it prints this is not a comment. Right? If you change them to double quotes, it also prints this is not a comment. And finally, comments always terminate lines, so it's not possible to insert a comment into the middle of a line of code. Right? So here, for example, if you wanted to list all the files that end with .txt, I guess that should be star txt. Right? This doesn't work. Right? The comment ends the line, so all of that gets commented out. Right? So instead of listing everything that ends in star txt, it just runs ls and lists all of the files in the directory. Right? Okay, so that's all we need to say about comments. It's actually probably a little bit too much, but anyway. All right, so you've seen that in your scripts, or most of the commands that you use in Bash, you type in the name of the command, and then there are extra arguments that you can pass in, right? So these are called the command line arguments to the command. Most scripts expect, or most programs either accept or expect command line arguments. So when you're writing your own scripts, you're going to need to be able to access those command line arguments. Right? The command line arguments in Bash are stored in what are called the positional parameters. Right? So they're parameters, so again, they're just variables. They have an unusual name. Right? Otherwise, they'd be called variables. Right? So it turns out the special parameters that hold the command line arguments have the names 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on. Right? So a number can also be the name of a variable in Bash. The number of command line arguments that are passed to a script are stored in the special parameter named hashtag. Right? So that's also unusual, right? So the hashtag is used to indicate the start of a comment, right? But it's also used as the name of the parameter that holds the number of command line arguments passed to a script. Right? The number of command line arguments is always one or more, because one of the command line sorry, that's not true. That's in C. The number of command line arguments is either 0 or more. Okay, so there's a little script here that's in that it's in one of the directories that you have access to. You can't run this script from inside Jupyter, because there's no way for you to access the command line. There's no way for you to provide command line arguments to a Jupyter cell. So when you run these examples, you have to run all of these in from your terminal directly. So this is the program called viewArgs.sh. So this shows you how to use the positional parameters. Right? If you want the number of parameters passed to a script, that's stored in the parameter hashtag. To get its value, it's $hashtag. If you want the first or the 0th parameter passed to a script, so we'll see what this is exactly in a minute, right? That's $0. Right? $1, that's the first parameter that's passed. That's the first parameter actually passed to the script, right? So the value of that parameter is $1, right? And so on and so on and so on, right? If you are expecting more than 9 parameters to a script, and you want access to them, you have to use these funny braces around the number. Right? So the 10th parameter is $, brace, then the 10, then the closing brace. Right? The reason you need the braces here is because if you don't put the braces in, Bash interprets that as $1, so it gives you back the first command line argument, and then there's a 0 attached to the end of it, right? Which is bizarre, but that's the way it works in Bash. Right? So if no braces, it's $1, followed by the string 0, which is strange. Okay, so let's try playing around with this viewArgs thing and see what we get. Okay, so it's inside the introduction to Bash scripting directory. Okay, so if I run viewArgs and pass in 0 command line arguments, the program prints the following. It says there are no command line arguments. Right? So $0 is always defined, or I guess the parameter 0 is always defined. Its value, $0, is the is what you typed in to run the script, right? So here, I typed in /view_args.sh. Right? If I go up one directory and run the script, right? So I'm up one directory, I'm going to run the script, right? Then it includes the path, right? So it's the full path to the command that was used to run the script. It's the full absolute path. Sorry, it's the full path that, yeah, it's the full path that it was used to run the script, right? In this case, it's a relative path. Okay, so let's try that one more time and see what we get. All right, so notice that $1, $2, $3, these are all blank, right? Which is another thing you need to watch out for in bash. Right? So that's what the script looks like, right? When I write $0, and it's not quoted, or if I write $1 or $2 and they're not quoted, I'm actually accessing the values stored in the parameters 0, 1, 2, and so on. Right? When I just ran that script, there was no command line argument, so you would think that $1 would be undefined, right? And if you were programming in a modern programming language like Python or Java, right, when you try to access an undefined variable, right, you end up with an issue. Right? Normally you end up with an error. You don't end up with an error in bash. Right? So accessing the value of positional parameter 1 is legal even if it doesn't exist. Right? The value that you get back is the empty string. Right? Accessing the value of positional parameter 2, even if it doesn't exist, is also legal, right? And so on and so on and so forth. If you access the value of a variable that doesn't exist in bash, bash automatically creates the variable and sets it to the empty string. So this is going to cause all sorts of problems if you are not very careful about how you spell your variable names. Right? Even if you're off by one letter, right, bash doesn't tell you there's a problem. Right? It simply makes a new variable that has that different variable name and sets it to the empty string. Right? And now you spend hours trying to debug your script to find out what's wrong. So be very careful about how you spell stuff when you are using variables in bash. Okay, so suppose I do pass in a command line argument. So argument number 1. Right? Now you have one command line argument, right? And the value of stored in positional parameter 1 is the string arg1. Right? arg2, arg3, and so on. Right? So when I pass in 3 command line arguments, their values are stored in 1, 2, and 3. Right? If you want to pass in a string, if you want to pass in a argument that has a space, you have to quote the space. You have to quote the argument, sorry. Right? So there I passed in a 4th argument, which is the string arg4 has spaces. Right? It's quoted, so the spaces don't count as word splits. Right? If you don't quote, right, you end up passing in 4, 5, 6 arguments. Right? So now you end up passing in arg4 and then has and then spaces. Right? So remember, if you're going to call a script and you want to pass in a string that has spaces in the string, you have to escape. You have to either escape the spaces or quote the string. Right? And that's true if you have special characters in the string as well. All right, so remember, to get the value of the number of command line arguments, it's $#, right? $0, that's how your script was run. It's the command that was used to run the script. $1, value of the first command line argument. $2, value of the second command line argument, and so on and so on and so forth. Right? It would be unusual to have 10 or more command line arguments in a script and access it this way. Right? There's other ways to access the command line arguments. Okay, that's fine. All right, so now that we've got access to command line arguments, now you can actually start to write scripts that are more useful. Right? So we had the hello world script that just said hello world. If you want hello world to accept the command line argument so that you can greet the user, right, you can access the value of command line argument number 1. Oh, I forgot to mention, you can always use braces around the name of a variable. Sometimes you must use braces around the name of a variable. right? And we'll get to that later on in the variable notebook. Right? So this script here expects one command line argument, right? When you run the program, it prints hello, comma, oops, sorry, hello, comma, and then the name of the command line argument. Right? Again, you can't run this from inside Jupyter, so you have to run it from a terminal. Hello, you, and how about sys220? Right? So one command line argument, and it prints out hello, sys220. Right? If you pass in more than one command line argument, everyone is morning. Right? So I pass in 3 command line arguments. It just ignores the extra command line arguments. Right? There's no error. Right? The value of the command line arguments, they're there in parameters 2 and 3, but the script isn't using them. Right? If you pass in no command line arguments, right, and this is the really confusing part. Right? So 0 command line arguments, 0 command line arguments, sorry. I think this space was there. Oh, wait, what's going on? 0 command line argument. Oh, hold on, I know what's going on. The script I'm running is not the same as the one that's in the script was edited. There. One. Okay. There we go. So no command line arguments? Oh, wait a minute. No command line arguments. There we go. There we go. Okay, so the script still runs. There's no error, right? Which kind of sucks, but that's the way it works in Bash, right? $1's not defined, so it ends up getting the value equal to the empty string when Bash interprets the script. If you actually read the documentation for Bash, you're going to see the phrase null string or null value everywhere. A null string in Bash means the empty string. Right? It doesn't mean, it's not the same thing as null in Java. Right? They mean the empty string. Okay, so you are free to play around with those scripts in that directory and play around, so run them with different values, just make sure you understand how they work. You're free to modify them to see if you can make them do unusual things or different things. Right. In the previous lecture, we had a little script that made a starting shell script for us. So there was .temp. Sorry. What was it called? Make shell. Right, so we had our little make shell script, and that made a file called temp.sh, right? And it stuck in the first line of a Bash script for us, and then it changed the mode of changed the permissions of the script so that the user had execute permission on them. Right? Now, obviously, you don't always want to call your script temp.sh. So it would be nice if you could call it something else, right? And if you passed in a command line argument to call it that, right? And that's what named shell does, right? So named shell is exactly the same, except now it uses the first command line argument as the name of the script. Right? So /named shell my script .sh, right? If you run it, right, you'll find that there is a whoops, right there. Right, there's your script, myscript.sh. If you look at its contents, notice it's green, so it's executable. Right? And inside the script, there's just the one line, right? The starting line of a Bash script. Okay, this example is a little bit more complicated than it looks. All right, so that looks okay, right? Even in the notebook, it's shown to you this way. This script contains a mistake. It actually contains 2 mistakes, right? So what happens when I run my script? What happens when I run, .name shell, and I pass in the name of a script that has a space in it? So my script. Well, there's my script.sh, right? Look inside my script. Oops, sorry. .sh, right? It looks fine. Okay, so when I run it that way, everything's fine. Right? If I forget to quote the input, right, and I call it something else, right, like that, right? So what do you end up with? You end up with my, right, and that's it, right? And it's now the script that way. It's now the script, right? So your script is no longer called my space script.sh, right? Why? Because as far as bash is concerned, there's just one command line argument here. Right? There's actually, so what happens when you, oh no, this is fine. The way it's written is fine. Okay. All right, so there's the introduction to writing a bash script, right? Remember, there are some things you have to remember, right? Number one, right, make sure that you remember to always start it with the hashtag exclamation mark, right? Also remember if you're in Mac, right, you're going to want to start it with user bin env bash, right? That runs the env program to find the correct version of bash to run the script. If you don't do this on your Mac, you end up running it. You end up running the old version of bash to run the script. So you end up running bash 3 point something, right? Where you should be running bash 5 in this course. Comments are just indicated by the hashtag, right? There are these funny things called parameters that are just variables with unusual names, right? The positional parameters 0, 1 through 0, 1, 2, and so on store the command line arguments, right? The positional parameter, the special parameter hashtag is the number of command line arguments. All right, any questions about simple bash scripting? Okay. So the next notebook is variables. So you have to be, so with this notebook, there's a section in it which was not updated properly when I uploaded everything to GitHub. So there's a big mistake in this notebook that I have to fix. So when I get to that section, I'll explain what's going on, right? And then I'll fix it later this afternoon. But there's a big chunk of the notebook that contains a very bad mistake. Okay, so you can make variables in bash. We've seen a few of them already, right? So when you create variables in bash, they are not typed, right? So as far as bash is concerned, everything is a string, right? If you look online, you'll see that you can set this, what's it called? You can sort of set a variable and say that it's an int or an integer, right? But you can still treat it as though it were a string. So the only type in bash are strings. Right? Depending on the context, the value of a variable, even though it's a string, it can be treated as an integer. Right? So inside an arithmetic expansion, the value of the variable, the digits of the variable, the digits of the value of the variable will be treated as though they were an integer. Although you're going to see later on that that's not always the case. There's no floating point arithmetic in bash, right? So bash is not really a general purpose programming language, right? If you need to do floating point stuff, you have to use some external program. There's no special syntax for declaring a variable in bash, right? Bash creates the variable the first time the name is used. It doesn't matter whether you're assigning to the variable or whether you're trying to access the value of the variable, which is the confusing part, right? In Python, you can make a new variable and assign a value to it, there's no problem, right? If you try to use an unnamed variable, an undefined variable in Python, that's when you get an error, right? In bash, it's different. If you try to use an undefined variable, you get the variable made for you and it gets assigned a value, right? So the equal sign is the assignment operator in bash, right? You must use no spaces around the operator. So this is the other confusing thing in bash, right? So in your previous programming courses, you might have been told you should always put spaces around your operators, right? In bash, you cannot put a space around the equals operator, around the assignment operator, right? So A, no space, equals no space 2, right? Assigns the string 2 to A, right? So it's not an integer, it's the string. B gets the value, B equals double quote some string, assigns the string some string to B. Right? You need the double quotes here because otherwise bash separates the string into sum and then string, and it tries to interpret that as a command, and then it barfs. That's a funny one, right? So if you want to do string concatenation in bash, right, you do it like this. Right? So if I have the variables A and B, right, the $ means get the value of A. Right? The $ here means get the value of B. Right? You're always allowed to put a variable name inside of braces when you want to access the value. Right? So $brace is always legal. Right? So what bash does here, right, it sees $A, $B side by side. Right? $A means get the value of A, so it gets the value of A and sticks in a 2. Right? So that expands, right? That's an expansion right there. Right? That's a variable expansion, parameter expansion. Right? So that expands to the string 2. Right? $B expands to the string some string. Right? And so the result of all of this is 2 some string. Right? So if I run that and then insert a new cell, insert below, right? And if I echo out, oops, sorry. Right? You do in fact get the concatenated string to some string. Right? Weird, but that's the way you do it. Right? And so what you need to remember here is that that actually is an expansion. Right? The value of the expansion is just the value of the variable A. Right? So the value of the variable A gets inserted into there, and the whole thing gets treated as a string. Right? Look at the value of B. Right? That's the string some string. So expand to some string and insert that, replacing the $B. And that gives you 2 some string. Okay, what happens if you put a space here? Bash complains. It says A command not found. Right? So what's happening here is bash sees A space equals 2. Right? It tries to interpret A as being the name of a command. Right? And you're passing in the argument equals 2. Right? So the space can't be there. Right? What happens if you put it on the other side? Right? Now it says 2 command not found, which is bizarre. Right? So it sees assignment here, A equals something, right? And then it sees a 2. Right? So it actually, in this case, creates the variable A, sets it to the empty string, and then tries to run the command 2. Right? Which no sane person would think would happen, but that's what happens in bash. Right? No spaces around the assignment operator. Right? Something similar happens here. Right? If I strike the quotes around that and run it, right? It now says command string not found. So what's it doing? It's doing the assignment B equals sum, right? So B is the string sum. It sees a space and now tries to interpret string as a command. Right? So don't forget to quote that. Right? Here, I guess, we can get rid of the braces. Right? And you'll still get the same result as previous. Right? So $A, that asks for the value of A, inserts the value of A for the $A. Right? $B asks for the value of B, inserts the value of B for B. Right? Everything runs, and C is 2 some string. Okay, so that dollar symbol, that is the variable dereference operator in bash. Right? So variable name gives you the value of the variable name. Right? Now, why do we need that $? Right? So you just go back to this example here and you say, well, let's suppose we didn't have the $. Right? Remember, everything in bash is just a string. So if I don't have the $, to get the value of the variable A, right? In other words, if I just try to write A, right? And if I just try to write B, right? Bash has no way to know that you want the value of A and the value of B. As far as Bash is concerned, this is just the string AB, right? So that's why you need the $sign, right? You need some symbol to indicate that you want the value of the variable. The designers of the Bash scripting language decided we'll use the $sign. Right? So you need a dollar and dollar. Right? The dollar sign indicates variable dereferencing, right? Or getting the value of a variable. Right? You can either write this as $var, right? Sometimes you must write it as $brace var, and I'll explain exactly when with an example shortly. Okay, so when you use variable name, that's called a parameter expansion, right? Or variable expansion. Right? So in this example here, the $message means get the value of MSG. Right? Notice that this occurs inside of inside of double quotes. Right? So double quoting does not suppress the meaning of the $sign. Sorry. Right? So even though that's inside double quotes, right, the $sign is still meaningful, right? It still does variable. It still indicates parameter expansion. Right? When you run this, you actually get welcome user. Right? If you strike the quotes, right, you still get the same message in this case. Right? So it looks like perhaps in this case the quoting is not necessary. All right. Here's another example. Right? This time I've got the $sign in front of the name user. Right? Now it turns out there is a variable called big user in Bash. Right? The value of all caps user is the name of the current user. Right? So $user inside of the quotes here indicates we want to get the value of the variable user and replace $user with the name of the user. Right? So there it prints my name in this case. Right? Now, if you misspell user as USR, right, there is no variable called USR in Bash. At least I don't think there is. You don't get an error. Right? Again, Bash creates. So Bash sees here, you're trying to get the value of the variable USR. There is no variable USR, so it makes a variable USR. Assigns the value of the empty string to USR, and carries on as though nothing was wrong. Right? So when you print the message, you end up with welcome and then the empty string. Welcome space empty string. Right? So once again, remember that if you accidentally misspell a variable, you're going to end up with a very hard to find bug, right? Because Bash doesn't indicate to you that you're creating a new variable or that the variable doesn't exist, right? It doesn't indicate to you that there's any error at all, right? It just makes the variable, gives it a default value, and carries on as though nothing were wrong. Okay. Most of the time you can get away with $ and then the variable name. Every once in a while, you must use that form instead. Right? Somewhere there's an example. I thought it was there. Where'd it go? Oh, it's going to be here. All right. Give me just a second here, and we'll. Well, why don't we just right? So let me get to that let me get to that example in just a second. Okay, so this whole problem of Bash creating variables when they're first used makes finding bugs very hard, right? So here, I haven't created a variable called y yet, but I'm going to try to access its value on that line right there. Right? So $y, get the value of y, then print the value of x. Right? So get the value of y, assign that to x, and then print the value of x, and that works. Right? There's actually the empty string here. You just can't see it because it's the empty string. Right? Right? So that works, no error. So that creation of unset variables, right, when you use the variable for the first time, is why you sometimes must use that form right there, right? So here's a script that's meant to back up a file, right? So it's called bad backup, but the point of the script is that you try to back up a file, you specify the name of a file that you want to create a backup for, right? And it calls the backup the name of the file underscore .bak, right? So it just makes a copy of the file and saves it as file name underscore .bak, right? So the input file name is $1, right? The output file name is the name of the input file name, right? So that's $in, right? And then underscore .bak, right? And then it copies the input file to the output file. Right. So in our script, so this is it here? Not expansions. What directory is this supposed to be in? Streams, variables. Okay, so it's called bad backup. Okay, so here's the, sorry. So here's the problem when you're working in bash, right? So you write your script and then you run it to debug it. So you type in some file name. I need a file name first, so I need to make some files. Okay, so there's my file ABC. I would like to make a backup of ABC. So I run my script, passing in the name of a file that I want to back up. Right. There doesn't seem to be any errors. Right. It also, hang on, copy, in $1, out is $, right. Wait, no, $in, right, this is correct. Right, and so you look at your directory and you say, hey, where's my file? Where's my backup file? It's nowhere. Right? Sorry, just a second. I just want to make sure this is actually doing what I want it to be doing. Oh, right, that's what's happening. Okay. Okay, so you ask yourself, so where's the backup file? And in fact, if you look at the script, right, some file should have been created, right? Because there's a copy command right there, right? So it copies whatever the name of the file, whatever the file was that you, whose name you passed in, right? It copies it onto something, right? If copy encounters an error, it would have complained, right? So you would have seen an error message of some kind, right? But we didn't, which is weird, right? And you don't see any new files in the directory either, right? Until you do something like -a, and then you realize that there's a file called .bak, right? So there's a hidden file now called .bak, which wasn't the intent, right? I'm looking for the file abc underscore .bak, right? And so now you go and look at your script and you say, what the heck just happened? Right? And so what happened is the following. Right? Okay, so the value of $1 was ABC, right? The value of out, so that looks like the value of in, right? That's exactly what that looks like, right? Which you think ought to be ABC. Right? What you have to remember, though, is that in a bash variable, the underscore is a legal character name. Period is not, but the underscore is. So bash actually thinks you want the value of in underscore. Right? It doesn't think you want the value of in. Right? It sees that there's an in underscore, so it treats that as though it were a variable name. Right? There is no variable name in underscore. So bash makes the variable in underscore, sets it to the empty string. Right? So what's the value of out? The value of out is the empty string .back. Right? So that copies ABC onto .bak, which is why we have a .bak file, but there's no there's no abc underscore dot bak, right? So in this case, right? So the correct version of the script is to put the variable inside of the braces, right? The braces delimit the, I guess it delimits the name of the variable that you want, right? So now bash sees $in, where the in is inside braces. So now it figures out, oh, you want the value of the variable in, right? And then you want the string underscore dot BAK. Right? So when you run that script, now you get ABC underscore BAK, right? And that works the way you expect it to. Right? So super confusing here. So that's the one reason why, that's one of the cases where you have to make sure that your variable access is inside of braces. Right? So that happens whenever you're using string concatenation after a variable name. Right? You have to be careful that whatever you're adding to the end of the string, that first character of that string is not a valid character in a variable name. So you can put the braces to indicate the limits of the variable name. Right? Some bash style guides say you should always put the braces around the name of a variable when you access its value, right? And that prevents these errors from happening. There's some other funny things in this script as well, right? So let's do this in the terminal. What time is it? Okay, so here we've got quotes around the $1, right? I've got quotes around $in underscore back, right? And here I've got quotes around $in and $out, right? And you ask yourself, well, why are we quoting these things? And you're saying, well, because you might run into the cases where there are funny characters in the name, right? And if there are unusual characters like a space in the name, right, I want to make sure that the shell doesn't expand or do word splitting on those values. Right? So what happens if you strike the spaces, the quotes? So I'm going to strike the quotes on the values on the right-hand side of the assignment. I'm going to save it, and now I'm going to run the script. Right, so there's no quotes around the assignment on the right-hand side. Right, so what happens if I pass in the name of a file? Sorry, I have to make a file. Some file with spaces. Right, so there's my sum file with spaces. I'm going to try to back it up and see if this works. Right. So does that work? The answer is yes, it works. Right, so that's good. Right, so it looks like the quoting wasn't necessary. Right, so removing the quoting here didn't seem to break anything. Removing the quoting here didn't seem to break anything. Right, and that is in fact the case. Right, if you're just doing simple assignment, right, so in equals the value of some variable, right, you do not need to quote the variable on the right-hand side, right? If the variable on the right-hand, if you're doing something extra with the variable, right? If it's not just simple assignment, you may have to quote the expression, right? But in simple assignment like this, you do not have to quote the right-hand side. What happens if you strike the quotes here? Right, so now I get rid of the quotes around the in and out there. Try to run the same script, and now you get an error message, right? And you get a very weird error message, right? It says spaces underscore dot back is not a directory. You look at the files that were created. Are there any weird? Okay, there were no weird files created, right? But the script is broken, right? So it says spaces underscore back is not a directory, right? And you go back and look at the script. Sorry, let me do it this way. Right? You go back and look at the script and you say, well, what happened? Right? And so the answer is, right? So whatever in was, it was file with spaces in it or something like that. Some file with spaces, where there were spaces in the actual name, right? Whatever the value of in was, that gets substituted there, right? And whatever the value of out was, it also gets substituted for out, right? So when I run, back up some file with spaces, right? The command that gets run is cp, right? What's the value of $1? It's some file with spaces. Some file with spaces, right? All of that's $1, right? The value of the first command line argument. Sorry, all of that is $in, sorry. Right? And what's $out? $out is some file with spaces underscore dot BAK. Right, that's $out. And so this is trying to copy, this is really going to get confusing. So this is a badly formed copy command. That's going to try to copy some onto something or something like that, right? What is this complaining about? It's complaining that, what's the actual error message? I don't actually know how bash parses that command. Whatever it does, though, it doesn't work. So here it looks like spaces underscore back is not a directory. So it looks like it's trying to copy that file, that file, that file, that file, that file, that file, and that file into this directory, right? Which doesn't work, right? So that's why the quoting was required back here. Right? So when you quote the value of $in and $out, right, that suppresses the word breaking, right? So now you get that, and that, and that, and that, right? And bash does what you expect it to, right? So when you're working with file names, when you're storing a file name in a parameter, or in a variable, sorry, when you're taking a file name, storing it in a variable, if you want to use that name somewhere else, like as an argument to CP or perhaps RM or something else, right? You have to quote the variable. You have to quote the variable dereference in order to prevent bugs like this from happening. All right. Okay, that's all I want to talk about for today. We'll finish off this lecture on tomorrow.
I just had a quick question about the test
Yep.
next week.
Yep.
Are there any review?
Yeah, I'll talk more about it tomorrow, and so I'll tell you exactly what's on the quiz tomorrow, or exactly what